Hi, everybody in constitutional history. Jim Corman here. It's September 9th, Wednesday, and I wanted to put up a quick video on that first section of material talking about the roots of the American constitutional heritage or trajectory. It just doesn't start out of nowhere, although I was always taught that when I was a younger person in high school and things like that, that we have an American Revolution, we break away, we want democracy, and we're really, really fed up with the tyrants of Mother England, and they're cracking their whips against us, and they're evil, and but we believe in democracy. We're Americans, and we're different, and we create this Constitution down in Philadelphia, and the rest is history. And there's checks and balances between the three branches. It's terrible. It's really awful because the reality is when our nation started, there's a prehistory to it. There's roots, and I know this part's boring for a lot of students. I get it, but it's really, to me, fascinating that most of the colonial revolutionary mindset was based upon the fact that they liked the British Constitution. They thought they were a part of the British Constitution, but they weren't being treated fairly under it. It wasn't being applied to them. And so they wanted representation to represent them in the constitutional government of Great Britain. And they didn't feel like they were getting it through something called virtual representation. I want you to know that term for the test. I'll hopefully find an article for you and post it. I'm petting my dog over here if you're wondering why I'm leaning over. Because I don't pet her. She just keeps rubbing up against me. So virtual representation was the British attitude about how representation occurred in Parliament. Virtual representation, it didn't matter where you were from in any part of the kingdom, you represented the whole of the kingdom. So if Leeds had some interest in terms of its community being advocated for, you didn't necessarily expect to have a representative from Leeds doing it. It could be from Birmingham, England, or it could be another part. It could be from Scotland. It could be part of the kingdom. They all had the responsibilities of fiduciary to represent the whole kingdom. The American colonists weren't buying that when tensions started coming out. When they wanted to resolve conflict, they said, we don't have any representatives over there. There's a whole ocean between us. We want members in the parliament that come from our soil, from our community. And that's something that is distinct in American politics that was different than Great Britain. We really felt that in order to be represented in a form of republic or democracy, the representatives had to come from the community for which they represented. That is different than what they had in Great Britain at the time. But a lot of the other principles that were applicable in Great Britain were thought of as very attractive to the American colonists. We liked the fact that they had juries or trial by jury, I should say. We liked the fact that they had the right to protect contractual rights in courts of law and civil proceedings. We liked that property could be owned and protected through government enforcement. We liked the fact that there was the rule of law. It's an ancient British principle, the rule of law, that there's a legal standard that can be known by everybody. It's applicable to everybody, and no one's above it. That predates the American Revolution, and we liked it as colonists, and we thought it was very much a part of our own heritage, and we just simply wanted it applied to us and for us to have representation in making sure those things are effectuated. Those things all existed in the British Empire. So why did we rebel? We rebelled because after 1763, those of you like history, and some of you might be taking U.S. History 1 or rehab, you know that we were part of the British Empire. Things are going great, but there's a system of mercantilism that benefits the mother country through trade. There's a Navigation Act. All the shipping should be done by British ships. If anything is sold to us from another nation other than Great Britain, it has to go through Great Britain first. So Great Britain always gets a bit bigger piece of the pie. The colonists did very well too, because it created an unbelievable trade boom between raw materials and finished materials. Everybody is happy, but Great Britain's getting fatter and happier, more so than the colonies. They were there to serve the mother country. So tension starts we should get maybe more of the cut. Was some of the tension. I don't buy that. I think that wasn't nearly as significant. What was significant was the 7 Years' War that ended in 1763, also known as the French and Indian War. British won. We win because we're thought of as a British colony. And some of you are going to say, wait a minute, whatever happened to the roots of our colonial history having to do with the Spanish and the Dutch and the Swedish and the French and all these other nations? Yeah, that's true. They definitely had an influence in terms of population, but in terms of governance, by 1763 and certainly 1776, we were British colonies, and we adopted the British common law, and their constitutional ideology and profile was very much a part of this nation. Not to diminish the others' contributions, but in terms of law and constitutional history, we were a British territory. So what happens at the end of the war? Great Britain wins. We didn't really contribute all that much in terms of coin, treasure, nor persons. There's some, but it was lackluster to say the least. Cost Great Britain a great deal of money to ultimately come out victorious against the French, which they were fighting with for forever. Now they're victorious, and I said, hey, they're in huge debt, and it's almost going to cause an economic ripple effect that might ultimately hurt Great Britain in the wrong run. So Great Britain's got to find a way to pay off all this war debt. And they say, hey, the colonists have never paid any taxes. We haven't really enforced the Navigation Act very strictly. We have let the colonists pretty much run their own show for all this time. We have to kind of bring them into the fold a little bit more to benefit us even greater in terms of economic contribution. And so we know it starts off with the Sugar Act, and that creates a great deal of friction between us and Great Britain. They repeal it, I think, within a year. And then the Stamp Act, which even created bigger friction. There was talk of revolution right then and there. We've never been taxed before. In fact, I do want you to know this term. Great Britain, up until that time, actually called the policy by which the colonists were treated in terms of self-governance and control as salutary neglect. Leave them alone. We're benefiting from it. Let them run their own little party over there, and everything's fine. But now we're what? We're trying to crack down with rules and extract some taxes. And the reaction by the colonists, because it was such a long history of never being directly taxed by the motherland without representation in terms of our people sitting in the parliament over in Great Britain, it shocked the colonists, and it shocked Great Britain that the colonists would react in such a violent way. We know after the Stamp Act, things go really, really bad because they try to put in some things like the Declaratory Act, which is basically declaring we, Great Britain, have the ultimate control, and the king can do whatever they want, and so can Parliament, and you guys have to obey. That insulted the colonists in a great many number. And then comes the Coercive Acts and the Townshend Acts, and basically they started taking away our right to have juries within our local community, taking away our local assemblies, our local governance that we chose. And it really came to a powderhead in basically a revolutionary war. But the concepts of constitutionalism, these parts and pieces of the British Constitution, which are made up of multiple declarations, rulings, court cases, proclamations of the king and Parliament, probably the most famous being the Magna Carta being part of the British Constitution, were all very much viewed with a certain degree of respect and admiration by the American colonists. They just wanted it for them, where they would participate in it, and Great Britain would hear none of it. They had something called virtual representation. Didn't matter where your members of the House of Lords came from or the members of the House of Commons. They represented the entire empire, including you in Massachusetts or South Carolina. We didn't buy it. We had a different attitude about the way in which governance should take place. It should take place by the permission of the governed, which wasn't that inconsistent with the British. But what was we didn't believe in virtual representation. We want our reps to come from our community. If you're representing Massachusetts, you live in Massachusetts, you're of Massachusetts, and you're chosen by people from Massachusetts. That was a bit novel in terms of the way the British government worked. So when we broke away, we liked many of the precepts in the British constitutional system. But again, it was a constitution. It was made up of many different parts. What we didn't like was it wasn't clearly articulated in one written document. So that was one of the things that the Americans, after we revolted and were successful, we wanted a constitution that was more, at least in terms of structure, written out in terms of the parameters of how the government structure would be and the limitations on governmental power in a more clear fashion. Were there limitations on Great Britain's power? Yeah, people had a right to be tried by jury, had to be right to be represented by counsel. All those things predate the American Revolution. They were part of the British constitutional history that we adopted. We took it on. It wasn't like we had tons of novel ideas, but some of them were about rights of representation in terms of in the government itself should come from within our community. That was one of the newer ones. So our roots are very, very much embedded within the British Constitution. We just wanted it for our own. So along comes the Civil War. We prevail with the help of the French. We'll use any help, right? It's the old story: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And we get to the next section of the module, and we talk about what we're going to create as a government. We looked to some of the things that we liked in the British Constitution, and we wrote those things out. But not initially. Initially, we had an initial constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which turned out to be a failure. But the concepts, where they come from? So they come from Great Britain, but they also come from great political philosophers that were being read and disseminated during the time. John Locke and Thomas Hobbes are big, John Locke being the biggest. This concept that there are certain alienable rights to participate in government, and that people should be able to design and pick their own government, and if dissatisfied with it, can reject it and replace it. Those ideas were, he was a British philosopher, those ideas were bantered about in Great Britain, but they were becoming really popular in America, especially as the American Revolution took hold. The next philosopher, if you can call him a philosopher, is a really interesting character because he kind of falls off the face of the earth after his second minor treaty. But he had the big one, common sense. These ideas were being floated around that, wait a minute, sovereignty. Sovereignty means power to make decisions, how we're going to be governed. If there's a conflict, the sovereign will make the decision. In Great Britain, it was the king, later the king and parliament. But in the United States, we believed it was what? Not the president, not the Congress. The power or sovereignty came from the people. That's where we really break new ground. Did it ever happen before? Yeah, it happened in Athens, Greece. It's happened in we know some Native American societies probably had some structure of government like that. So we're taking some of the themes from Great Britain. We want to adopt them in our own, but we like this concept that the people, and we don't mean all people by any means. That's one thing I'll get into. We talk about the Articles of Confederation in our actual Constitution. We talk about the people ruling themselves through choosing their government and their leaders. We weren't talking about everyone participating in this choice process, certainly not enslaved African Americans. We didn't call them Americans at the time, but enslaved Africans. Certainly we didn't include women. We certainly didn't include the poor. We were talking about at least modestly wealthy white males of adult age. So we didn't count children either. But that doesn't mean those aspirational concepts of being self-ruled didn't eventually become what we see it as today, which is a very much more democratized nation. So in Chapter 1, the origins of the Constitution, we're going to break away from Great Britain's yoke, but we're not going to necessarily want to leave all the concepts and undergirdling of what their Constitution meant, but we wanted it in writing. We wanted representation to be home rule, if you will. And we wanted the sense that the power came from the ground up based upon these philosophies that were really floating, especially common sense. John Locke, if you ever read John Locke's writings, they're kind of heady. You got to be pretty literate to really eat that stuff up. But Common Sense by Thomas Paine is one of the most readable little novelettes that I've ever read. And I had to read it in community college, out in Springfield Technical Community College when I was a kid. And we had to read it in American literature, I think. I don't think it was in a history class. And I got to admit, after I read it, I felt a little bit, confident and proud of this concept of self-rule. That arguably, when you think about the revolution brewed over many, many years. It took almost over a decade really to get to armed conflict with Great Britain. There's like a theory going around that, maybe a quarter of the people wanted to stay loyal and be part of the British Empire. Maybe a third wanted to revolt and create their own nation. And the rest gave terrible fractions there to make it really difficult to figure out the rest, but almost a majority, probably equal to the amount of people that wanted to rebel, were what we call fence sitters or straddlers, because their farm's going pretty well, they're making some coin, the world's not they're not political, they're not necessarily all that well read, and they're putting food on the table, they got a decent farm. I don't really want to rebel against Great Britain, but I don't really want to antagonize my neighbors who do. I just kind of want to stay out of this thing. That took a while. And some people think the turning point of finally making the decision to really get up in the sense that we want to be self-governed might have been Thomas Paine's Common Sense. That novel was so well read and so well disseminated, short, it's easy read. Um, Changed a lot of attitudes, and it really, some people think it's the shift in mentality to create a real government. So, some of you are going to find it really boring. The roots of our constitutional history all go all the way back to the Magna Carta and many of the principles that Great Britain had. But it's true, we didn't reject everything that was in the British concept of governance and people's rights. In fact, there was a lot of rights for individual people incorporated within the British Constitution. We didn't like the fact that we weren't allowed to participate in more of a direct way. And that brings me, although this was more about U.S. History 1, we're a democracy, and we created our Constitution in the Articles of Confederacy first, and then our U.S. Constitution that we still have to this day, and that was created in 1787. We don't have pure democracy. In fact, our framers feared pure democracy probably more than anything else in the world. I'm going to kind of leave you with this thought. They thought of it as mob rule, and it was the greatest tyranny of all was democracy. It shocks a lot of you. I don't know, when I was a kid, I was really patriotic. My father was in the military, not when I was alive, but, when he was young, he was in the Navy, and he fought in the Korean War. And I had an American flag on my wall, Mr. Patriot, America's the greatest, all that kind of stuff. And little did I know that slogan, I'm fighting, or we're fighting for democracy. Not pure democracy, because pure democracy is just the majority rules, and that's it. And we don't defend or protect minority. And I'm not talking ethnic or racial minorities here or religious minorities. I'm talking about the unpopular view, or the dissidents somehow could be outcast, or could be locked up, or could be disenfranchised, or somehow expelled from the nation if they're unpopular. And so we created something called the Republic. And as I get older, I recognize that pure democracy is just that. If everything is about popularity, my goodness, what kind of decisions would be made in terms of a knee-jerk, impassioned decision by mob rule? I don't know if I'm so keen on it. I think our framers had a good insight on it, and they wanted what we call a republic, which is a type of democracy, or called representative democracy. We basically pick, sometimes indirectly, the representatives that will go and speak for us in our government. And they have to live within a set of rules determining what they're allowed to govern over, what they cannot touch, and what they are actually obligated to protect. And that's the Constitution of the United States. It actually gives me a great deal of hope, because especially in the political era we're in right now, I'm always hearing things like, the president can do that, the president can't do that, this is Congress's job, this can't happen, or this must happen, this should happen. Sometimes I lose sleep over it a little bit, because I'm very civically engaged, and I don't like the acrimony and the vitriol that's going on between people. Neighbors are hating each other over politics. It's really sad, but we actually have a lot of that through history. This isn't that new. Maybe the volume is a little bit louder, but it's always been an underpinning of our country. But you know what gives me sleep at night? Besides a box of wine, what makes me sleep at night is the constitutional protection that my government can only do so much. They only have so much jurisdictional power, and they can be changed if the people are dissatisfied. And even the rules of government, if we find they're unworkable, we can actually amend the Constitution. It hasn't always been beautiful. It hasn't always been perfect. It has had a history of sexism, racism, and inequities in it. But the Constitution has actually fixed, or attempted to fix, many of the things that we've recognized were wrong in our history. That's the beautiful thing about it. It's an aspirational document. I get excited just thinking about it. It really is a beautiful thing, because the framers built a evolving set of principles that not only allows the majority to rule, but protects those of us that find we are in the minority in terms of viewpoint or position or philosophy. Really, I think is very, very exciting. So we got the American Revolution. I'm going to leave you off with that. We know the roots are basically stemming from British history, and we wanted to adopt a lot of that, but we wanted representative government, a form of democracy that we could participate in. Our reps that we're actually going to go to work in government, we're going to come from within our communities. Other than that, we'll find shortly after, really not that long, well, after the War of 1812, our ties with Great Britain become very, very strong because our views on governance and politics aren't really all that different. We're probably our strongest ally throughout history since that period of time. Thoughts, concerns, questions, please shoot me an email, give me a call, shoot me a text, and we'll talk more. But when we really get into it, I mean, we're going to talk about this stuff. We just have to. I know somebody's going to be put you to sleep. 20-minute video. If I see a YouTube video and it's more than 5 minutes, I ain't watching it. But this is a class. I hope you watch it. But when we get into nitty gritty, we got to really talk about not the Articles of Confederation so much, but we're going to talk about some of the strengths of that. Everyone says, piece of crap, didn't work. Loose Confederation in 13 colonies. No one had to do anything, so it falls apart. It's ineffectual. It actually had some things that are very beneficial, and some people still advocate certain types of government relationships that are akin to the Articles of Confederation, basically less government and more local rule. And then we'll talk about the actual contractual agreements that were petitioned for and advocated for at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And we'll look at some of the original writings of the supporters. Some of you might like this play, Hamilton. My wife's a junkie over Hamilton, and so are her daughters. And they I guess it came out of Disney, and they went to it live. They spent all that money and went to the play while I sat in a bar. I didn't think I'd like it, but I heard it's excellent. But Hamilton is one of the writers of these Federalist Papers that we have to review because we're trying to understand what the Constitution means, right? And I know it's a relatively short document. You could read it in an hour, maybe a little more than an hour because of the language. But do you know what it means? No, we have to look at what the framers meant, and we have to look at how court cases came about. But we're going to read some of the Federalist Papers, and that's Hamilton. And if you like that thing, I guess it's on Disney now. I don't know if it's free. I think it is because my wife always asks me to watch it, and I always come up with some kind of excuse like having a brain aneurysm. I can't watch it. I don't know why I'm so resistant to watching it because everyone tells me it's excellent. But Hamilton is one of our great framers. So is Madison, and there's so many others. And they wrote. That's what's beautiful about this period of history. There's writings to tell us what their intent was when it comes to the framework of government. And I get excited about it. I like this stuff so much, and hopefully you will too. You want to know what you're complaining about or what you're proponent, you're a proponent of, and you want to be able to do it in the framework of the Constitution. If you don't understand its parameters, it's kind of like going out and hunting for something and you come back with a turkey, and I was asking to get me some venison. It's really hard to play within civics without understanding the rules of civics, and that's where the Constitution comes in, both state and federal. I'm going to talk a little bit about Massachusetts Constitution too, because that's deeply embedded in the federal Constitution is the state of Massachusetts. Otherwise, sorry I went a little long. Again, don't be afraid to do a shout out and talk to me about some of these things that you're thinking about and have questions about. Otherwise, we'll see you in a couple days with another video.